Good afternoon. This is Jill Kelly, and I am interviewing Emily Chambers Sharpe at the Samaritan's Purse in Boone, North Carolina on April 15th. So thank you for joining us today. Will you please briefly tell us about yourself and your family, things like where and when you were born, how you came into this line of work?
Yeah. I was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1978 to parents who, my father was in seminary at the time at Southwestern Theological, getting a doctorate in musical arts. And my mom was staying home with my older brother. From there, my family moved several times. We went to Kentucky and to Virginia, and then we made it back to Texas, only to find myself living in Tennessee, in East Tennessee, for my high school years. So we did a lot of moving around as my dad would minister at different churches in the Southern Baptist denomination. And my mom has long roots in Texas. In fact, a lot of people say that, but there's Six Flags historically over Texas. My family roots go back for at least 5 of the Six Flags. And as best we can tell, just for fun, one of my great aunts says that they have found evidence that we must have been servants at a Catholic mission somewhere in Texas all those many, many years ago, because we certainly didn't own any property or have anything to speak of. But you can just find records of our people. So that's the sort of long history of where we are. And now I live in Charlotte, North Carolina with my family.
And so where did you go to college?
I went to college at Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. And it was a really good experience. I got a scholarship. Thank you to the state of Tennessee.
And what did you study?
I did what a lot of college students do and found that I had studied a little bit of this and that, and then I tried to figure out what of that can make a degree in 4 years, and it looked like it would be English with a minor in French, and I also did music as a minor.
Oh, nice. And then, so how did you come to work for Samaritan's Purse? I think there was a stop along the way, maybe?
Yeah, so leaving undergrad, I had a sort of mix of dreams and ideas about what it might be that God would have for me in the world, but I knew that God had a vocational calling in my life. And I thought I might end up going, I'd heard about some programs through different groups that would allow you to go and teach English in various parts of East Asia. So I kind of thought about that for a while, but I ended up going out through my denomination through a couple-year program and first studied Arabic in Egypt, and then went into Sudan and lived in Sudan for a few years. And while I was living there, I worked on several different assignments with a small NGO or non-governmental organization. And one of those assignments was about working with youth impacted by HIV in Sudan. Okay. And we made a newsletter that would go to other youth to teach them about what is HIV and what are its impacts. And several of those kids that worked with me had a parent living with HIV at the time. And so this was my first exposure to HIV in sort of a program space. But my mom had a cousin who died of AIDS in the 80s. And so I was vaguely aware of that and learned more of the story, honestly, as I got older and got involved in this work. But we had, through that work, I got exposed to some things, came back to the US after my couple of years, was trying to decide what were my next steps. And I saw that there was an opening to work actually in the communications department at the Samaritan's Purse, which I applied for. And somebody in the HR called me up and said, "We see that you did something with HIV and that you've written grant proposals." And I said, "Yeah, I've done that work." And they said, "Well, we have an opening working on this project called Prescription for Hope. And we wonder if you would be interested in that." And because I did not have a job, I said, "Oh yeah, I'm really interested."
Naturally.
I also find that sort of silly pathway, I mean, I call it silly, it's how God has worked in my life, really, most of the time.
Yeah, that's tremendous. So as we shift into this work, we like to ask everyone to describe PEPFAR for a general audience.
Yeah. So I came here to work right around the time that PEPFAR got launched in 2004, or was it the end of 2003? And it was the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And kind of to back into this story, at that time that I was working in Sudan, I had done these small projects related to HIV. I went to South Africa for something, and I asked to see what was happening with HIV in South Africa, because I knew they might have things I could learn. I went to visit a clinic in a rural area, and there were people lying 3 to a bed. Seeing that really broke my heart, and I left feeling a really heavy sense that we might, as the world, be leaving a lot of lives, maybe millions, behind with HIV. And I kind of knew at that time there had been this pledge that 3 million people would be on HIV treatment by 2005. It was called the 3x5 pledge. And I had no sense that that would be a reality at all. There seemed to be a lot of desire among advocates and experts, but not a lot of commitment. So when PEPFAR was announced, it was the US government making this first initial commitment. I think they said 15 million at first, it ended up being 18 for 5 years. They would select countries that were highly impacted by HIV, and they were going to send money to look at prevention, care, and treatment, and include quite a bit of emphasis on orphans and vulnerable children, because orphanhood was a really big deal. And the goal was really going to be to try to see, like, can we get a lot of people on treatment? What can we do? And around the same time, the Global Fund was also launched, and the US made a commitment to support that. The Global Fund supported 3 of the biggest epidemics, so TB, AIDS, and malaria.
Okay, thank you. And so what that means is through your work, you had a pretty good sense of the global nature of the pandemic and the extent of the pandemic. And you got this call from Samaritan's Purse, and I think you became the HIV/AIDS team leader in international relief for the Prescription for Hope. Why did you want to take on this job?
Yeah, I mean, when I came to Boone, so the way the interview at Samaritan's Purse, they bring you up to Boone because it's a little bit remote, it's kind of hard to get to, so typically you end up staying and spending a bit of time. And when I came in for the interview, well, first night as a silly historical moment, it was a Super Bowl, and it was a Super Bowl that's famous for an incident with someone's costume. And I was eating dinner with some people who were hosting me from here, and the 3 of us did not understand what had happened while we were eating dinner, and we had a very funny shared moment. And I thought, well, these are my kind of people, because I really enjoy a funny shared moment. The next day when I came in to meet with folks, and we started talking a lot about people living with HIV, the thing that I kept saying over and over again, and that I felt echoed in the hearts of people here, was that it's not a sin to be sick. And what we want to do with HIV is make people understand that while it might be a sexually transmitted infection, again, it is not a sin to be sick. And I was really excited about the idea that folks recognized there were church leaders and missionaries and people all over the world who have been in the face of this crisis doing the very best they could, bringing baskets of fruit to church to spread among orphans. Pastors who were saying they were tired because of how many funerals they had to do. And talking with people here, I just had that deep connection that we knew there was something to be done. And the original idea was that we were going to take, as a follow-on to this big conference that Samaritan's Purse had led, this big database of folks, and try to see, where do we go from here? But around the time I arrived, PEPFAR launched some of its first initiatives and said, we really want to bring people in to either work on programs for orphans and vulnerable children, or what they called ABY programs, which were about abstinence and behavior change focused on youth. And when those opportunities to write concepts came to be, it was something I was pulled into straight away.
That's wonderful. So can you tell me about what this is you're being pulled into? Tell us about Samaritan's Purse, HIV/AIDS ministry, and Prescription for Hope.
Okay, yeah. That's several questions. Yes. I'm going to try this little steps. Prescription for Hope had been this conference that launched a lot of thinking by bringing some really influential folks like Strom Thurmond, the Senate, was he the Senate Majority Leader at that time, I think? Or am I wrong about that?
I don't think he was the Majority Leader, but he was the Senator.
He was a senator. Yeah, longtime senator. And then a fairly new senator at the time, Bill Frist, who was later the Senate Majority Leader, a number of other folks into Washington, D.C. And then they also brought some of those very people I was just talking about, pastors who had buried too many folks, little widows who had organized their churches to bring fruit and clothes to take care of orphans in their communities, missionaries and missionary doctors, to give testimony, not just to how devastating HIV was, but to say that we actually also have a prescription for hope, that it does not have to be just this sad story. There's also the story of the fact that there are pastors that are going to continue to serve. There's all these other people. And it opened the eyes of a lot of people, together with a lot of other really amazing advocacy efforts that were kind of happening in tandem. Bono had done this kind of Heart of America, I think it was the name of this tour, that went around and, had stirred up a lot of this, and also was talking to some of these same folks. And then the idea was like, hey, there's something we can do, that we as Americans can engage in the world in a way that comes from the compassionate heart of who we are. George W. Bush, I think, was using a lot of language like, when we see the man on the side of the road that's being beaten up, we will not just pass him by, right? Like, we're going to be these good neighbors. And I think it was a really important act of goodwill in a world where people were seeing America respond really aggressively after 9/11. And so there was this moment, and in that moment, having those missionaries and those church leaders and those widows share their hearts and have people sort of be called to see where our faith engages with this issue, I think it was really a catalytic moment. And then from that, we had a database as Samaritan's Purse of ministries all over the world, ranging from that small fruit basket kind of thing to bigger initiatives, where Tenwick Hospital in Kenya, that we've partnered with for a long time, had been working to do treatment as they could, although treatment was very hard to come by, or very expensive, doing a lot of testing on HIV. So we had that whole gamut. We had, when I first came in, one of my key roles was actually taking that prescription for hope, and we worked on developing a packet of materials that we could take to church leaders. And that was the Prescription for Hope packet that we took to folks in places like Honduras and Dominican Republic. We did this in India. We did conferences in Cambodia. We kind of went all over with these materials. And our whole goal was to make sure that we captured, first of all, what are the simple things that any church can do to be responsive to God's general call to Christians for being engaged in the world and caring for the hurting, and how those could help people living with HIV or people affected by HIV in the church. We also integrated into that sermon guides to help pastors address things, everything from personal behavior that could keep you safe from spreading the virus or getting the virus, to things that Christians really needed to be inspired by in order to keep hope alive where their congregations had been really impacted. And we kind of organized these mini conferences around the world. So that was what was going on with Prescription for Hope. And alongside that, I guess then you ask about what was going on with this sort of U.S. government.
Okay, so let's pause there, because you've said a few things that I want to learn more about before we come to the U.S. government. So will you tell me a little bit about developing this material? Right.
Okay.
So what were you reading? Where were you learning the things that would shape the material you developed for the packet and for the mini conferences?
Okay, great. Well, we had a little team of folks. One was this wonderful woman, Dr. Lul Janina, who has gone on to be with the Lord, but she was a wonderful doctor from Honduras, and she was providing a lot of like the clinical kind of aspects of this work. We had Sally Pulaski and her husband, Tim, he was our country director in Honduras and was really motivated by Dr. Lul to be engaged in this. And Sally was just passionate about getting pastors to take leadership in this issue. And so we had a little team of folks that would sit together. And then we also had a team from Samaritan's Purse in Mozambique at that time that was doing a small project under what was called it's funny because there's been a million things with exactly the same name and acronym, so I cannot remember what it stood for, but it was like CORE initiative or something. Anyway, in CORE, there's been a million cores in my career. But CORE was initially like kind of working with little faith and community, smaller partners to do some HIV work. And they had been experimenting with how can we mobilize pastors. So they had some materials that they had been using, and they were primarily like flip books that showed pictures, because we found that folks in rural Mozambique were not highly literate. And so using those flip books were a really good way to talk to. So we had these materials, we had folks kind of seeing it, and then we had all of the Prescription for Hope big Washington conference testimonies and stories. So we were kind of going through those and looking for like, what are examples of like little to no cost ministry ideas? What are examples of biblical sermons or thoughts that folks have had? Where can we pull out here? So from all of that kind of rich data, and from some materials that were put together actually by, what is the group? It's now based out of Atlanta, and they do mostly medical, like, I feel like supply and equipment. Anyway, there was a group based out of Atlanta. They had some work. We had some materials from Africa Inland Mission. Basically, we looked through and combed through what everyone had done up to that point, and we were like, what can we put together and kind of make this pastor's packet? Mm-hmm. And at that time, everywhere we went, we were looking at contextualizing and putting it into the local languages, and then also making sure that it got printed. Oh, South Sudan is a place where we did one of these. We did these in lots of countries, so trying to make sure I can cover some of these. But those local conferences were meant to be like, well, if nothing else happens, like regardless of some big government initiative or whatever, we can bring these folks together. And I'll just give an example of the South Sudan one. The South Sudan one came about right around the time of the peace agreements in 2005 for South Sudan. So I think it was around 2004 when we started meeting with pastors and the Sudan Council of Churches, because Sudan was still one country at the time. And we would meet with them in Khartoum, and then you had to wait around in Khartoum for a few days because folks had to go apply for you to be able to travel in the country, you know. And then we would go down to Juba, and Juba was barely, you know, a town at that time. Like it had one main road, and would work with the Council of Churches office there. And they had this lovely guy who was leading their health department. And we had this vision to bring in pastors from all over South Sudan for this conference. And we settled to have it at the grounds of the largest in Juba, Sudan Pentecostal Church. So it's just a big church with a big grounds. And we were going to bring in 270 pastors, youth leaders, and women's leaders from churches all over South Sudan, which to get them there involved, traveling by boat and on foot and all these other things. We had the youth groups from several churches dig latrines, extra latrines for the church because we were going to be hosting so many people on this grounds. We hired women from the market to come and do like the cooking of lunch because she's not like a caterer in South Sudan. I had arrived coming from elsewhere in Africa via Addis Ababa on a series of flights that went comically and nearly tragically wrong. So by the time I arrived, I had nothing but like the t-shirt and skirt that I arrived in. And one of the pastor's wives in Juba noticed that and had 2 dresses made for me in the market. So African style, like really nice. And I was so thankful because I was really gross and sweaty. But the whole, like just to bring these pastors together was this a major affair. And it was folks from, I was talking about the Pentecostal church, but one of the lead speakers was a local South Sudanese Catholic priest who had been trained in Rome and was super motivated about HIV and had like actually shared this whole story with me walking through the Stations of the Cross and how they could parallel God's being with people who live with HIV and how close Jesus wanted to come to folks who were suffering in this way. So we had this really wild time because we had to sit people in language groups. And I think we had like 9 or 10 different language groups seated again in this room. And there was like 1 translator per group who would sit, and some speakers spoke in English and some people spoke in South Sudanese Arabic, and everyone would just sort of translate around there. And it wasn't even table because we had pews, and so we just made them in these kind of weird U shapes around the room. And we had these materials that we primarily did again as like these flip books and tried to make them really pictorial for there. We didn't print things that were a lot of heavy words. And the pastors in the workshop, one of the ideas that kind of we had in talking with a lot of different folks was they actually worked on making sermon outlines of their own in their own languages, right? After hearing some sermon preached, and they would think through, okay, well, what would I say to my congregation? And they'd be in their similar language groups to talk about it. It was a really wild time. And I think, I don't know, probably one of the wildest conferences I've ever seen. And that, no one ever thinks of having a bunch of ladies with like a fire in a tin box and a giant pot that's cooking up soup as the catering for 270 people and youth groups digging latrines, But what really made it amazing is that, then at the end of every day, all these folks who had traveled in, they would line up and we would be giving them like a little tiny stipend so that they could have a meal that evening and a place to stay. And it was, maybe slightly organized chaos and also a way to train people that otherwise they didn't have anyone coming to say, let's talk about this.
So life-changing for those people who are involved. Yeah. So I hear you talking about, paying the caterers and getting people stipends and getting them to Juba. And I have in mind earlier today when Reverend Graham said, people in the early days really didn't donate money to Samaritan's Purse for HIV issues, right? So how was Samaritan's Purse funding this and supporting? And because I'm also thinking about the costs of printing. Were you printing things somewhere on the continent and taking them to Juba, or in Khartoum and taking them to Juba? Tell us about that kind of on-the-ground work and the kind of structural support that Samaritan's Purse made all of this possible.
That's a great question. I think, one of the things that's really been amazing in my history with Samaritan's Purse, and I think this is still true, is that while people may not want to give to particular things, there is a lot of emphasis to give to just what is most needed. And so Samaritan's Purse tries to have available money that allows it to do what I really think its founder had in mind, which was that it is a purse, right? This is the bag the Samaritan carried with his coins. so that he could make sure that he could pay for a hotel room for this guy to get good rest who had just been beaten up on the side of the road. And I think that's what that where most needed money is. It's like sort of where we put that. And so there's some of that. And then there were a few foundations and donors that we're starting to recognize. And I think some of them may have been involved in Prescription for Hope, the big conference. And those folks gave in a way that was really generous to help make this possible. And then you ask about these materials. So what I remember is going around in Khartoum. So I had lived there previously, and I had some language skills, and I had some ability to get around because, by the way, the reason we had an office in Khartoum was to respond to this massive crisis in Darfur, which was escalating at that time and required a lot of attention. And so it wasn't like our country director locally was going to have a lot of time to go and do all this stuff. And I remember going into like a print shop in downtown Khartoum that you would wonder, like, what is going to happen here? What is going to actually come out from this print shop? And I remember like a stream of mostly Westerners coming in and out to do business with this same printer. It was a printer that the Sudan Council of Churches had recommended, and we were talking with them, and I really wasn't sure. I mean, a lot of what we would do was prepare these files and get them all ready and send them to these printers, and then you kind of hope for the best. The translation was handled with the Sudan Council of Churches into all these different languages, and we determined how many we were going to do and what the print run would be in each one, and which things we would leave in English. So mostly what we tried to do was print in languages the materials that had the low literacy materials, right? Flip books, things like that. And then the higher literacy materials that would require more reading, most people are educated in English or in Arabic. And so we ended up deciding to print those in one of those two languages from my best recollection.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And so you are working on these packets, these conferences, and PEPFAR is announced. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, PEPFAR would have been announced a little bit earlier, but the call is made for organizations to apply for funding.
That's right.
So can you talk a little bit about what was happening within the kind of Prescription for Hope ministry in thinking about whether or not PEPFAR would work through the ministry and what you were already doing?
Yeah. Yeah, the call came for originally what they call concept notes in our business, which is like you do your best idea usually in about 5 pages of what you can do, and you typically have to show some kind of past performance with some donors. If it's a U.S. government donor like USAID, that's even, probably more favorable. And so we got this call and we started looking around at what we had, and we kind of conceptualized 2 at the time. One was around orphans and vulnerable children, which we thought, let's look through our database and see where do we have a concentration of different partners who had come to the conference and what were they doing to support orphans and vulnerable children, and how could we kind of come alongside them and kind of build a really good network. And we kind of looked at that and mapped it with where we had offices as well at the time. And then on the side for youth, the abstinence and behavior change for youth, we looked at our program in Mozambique that was doing similar work, and we thought, what would we do the same or different if we could take that idea and build it up at scale? Because we really felt like that was a USAID funded project already. This core initiative was out of USAID, and it had some elements of materials already working. And so maybe what we could do is kind of look and see what lessons we could learn. So we started talking to folks there and asking some questions. We were doing a lot of calls back and forth. And we put together these 2 concept notes, and those are usually a fairly tight turnaround, and this was definitely the case. And so we handed them in and submitted them, and within a few weeks we got feedback on our concept notes. And we did not succeed on the OVC one, but we did on this ABY program, the Absence and Behavior Change for Youth. And we got feedback as well, kind of asking us to consider, you know, in the feedback, they were telling us things to look out for as we developed a full proposal. And that launched us on a big trip where we went out to the countries that we would build the program in.
Do you remember what year this was?
Yeah, this was all in 2004.
2004, okay.
So first we went to Mozambique, which is where we had a program going. Mm-hmm. We went out and visited this project just as along the way, as we went out to this very rural area that is on the border with Zimbabwe. And along the way, there was, you follow along by a train track, and there was a huge train car that had turned over on its side, and it was full of sugar. And as we moved forward, we saw loads and loads of people walking towards the train, even from really far distances, the further we got from it, because folks were going, hoping they could be helpful and possibly also get some sugar. And I remember this distinctly because it was a reminder that HIV is a layer of an issue that was already, you know, like these were folks who already had some other struggles. This was an area where people already struggled to think about where was their food security. They already struggled to think about, you know, where was the next meal going to come from. And now we have this issue of HIV with no real solutions. And so we went out into this area in Mozambique, and we're trying to see what was working, what was going on in this project, and what seemed to be useful, what seemed to be something that we could replicate and maybe take to scale, and what maybe needed to be tweaked. And so that was our first stop. And then from there we went to Uganda and to Kenya. And at the time we didn't have an office in Ethiopia, but we were going to open one within the next year or so, and we were thinking that that would be a target area as well.
Can you tell us, you know, kind of generally about these offices? You know, as you're moving across these spaces, are there employees in the various offices that that speak English, that can speak with you? You know, so I heard you say you studied, you know, French and Arabic, but you know, Portuguese speaking Mozambique, and you know, what's the experience of that like as you're learning from people on the ground about what's possible?
Yeah. So a lot of our key staff, program managers, and those folks are English speakers. Okay. They're working with us, and so we could talk with them. And they were able to talk with other local staff that were hired to give us information. We also met with some partner organizations, like from our big database that I was talking about, in all these places. Ugandans and Kenyans are notoriously better English speakers than folks from Texas and Tennessee. So I learned a lot talking with them, but I think that, so I was thankful. I mean, I encountered a lot of people who were English speakers. We, in each of these countries, had a country director. In those times, they were Americans and Canadians primarily in all those countries, and kind of young folks. Well, can I call Scott Hewitt young folks? That's a good question. He's a friend who still works with Samaritan's Purse as the director of World Medical Mission. But I think that he was the director for Kenya at the time. And then there were a couple of folks, a guy named Jeff Aronson in Uganda, and I think Paul Jimson was the country director of Mozambique when we started, and then it moved to Joseph Lai. So I'm kind of trying to remember way back.
You're doing great. Andrew
Simons was the first country director for Ethiopia. So these are the guys that, they were all kind of young folks. Many of those folks that I'm mentioning had themselves like kind of a missions background or grew up as missionary kids. So a lot of them had a lot of experience in the region, but they were really good at understanding from Samaritan's Purse side kind of who Samaritan's Purse is, because it is an American organization with Christian ties, and then had some experiences around the region as well, and really built up strong teams with a mix of expats and local staff and a lot of programs that, we entered those countries for different reasons and in different ways at different times that I don't know all the stories of. But for this particular project, we were doing a lot of talking about, okay, well, how could this work? What would this look like if we were bringing this project in? What would really be important? How would we format all of this? What are the steps going to be? And we kind of got this idea, and I don't remember if this came up at the concept note stage or if it was during those visits, but I think it really got solidified that we would do this thing we called MET, mobilizing, equipping, and training, that there were these three kind of important pieces. We needed to first be able to engage people in a way that got them interested and also certain that they could be efficacious in taking action at the community level. So that's the mobilizing piece. Equipping was giving people skills, tools, resources. And then the training piece was that we thought we need to have more than one layer of this. And this kind of built on, again, these experiences from the small Mozambique program where they really had kind of mostly adopted these Africa Inland Mission tools. And we realized that we were being asked to look at how can you really impact behaviors in young people and among couples that will look at HIV prevention. And that would be abstaining from sex until marriage, or as it's more technically put, delaying sexual debut among young people, especially looking at really young kids, ages 10 to 14. And then really encouraging couples to be faithful so that there's monogamy in relationships, which is really secure for highly HIV prevalent areas, that you won't spread HIV. And then to bring in a real emphasis on getting tested for HIV so that you know your status and all those things. So to do this, when we looked at those materials, we thought we need to go a little further and we need to do kind of two different things. And I think the first thing is that the training piece is going to be about, let's get people to think about this and understand what HIV is, know how it's transmitted, know what HIV is versus AIDS. That HIV is this virus that leads to this immunodeficiency syndrome. Help people to understand what are their options when they know that. And that piece really emphasized testing. We kind of went a little further than the Africa Inland Mission materials did, but we talked about transmission and facts, and we worked on stigma quite a bit. Helping people to I think that to mobilize people to act, they had to recognize they don't need to be afraid. And then the next layer of training needed to be, once folks had that, we said, let's give people this training, give them some tools to work with, and while they're doing it, if they kind of follow through on the commitments that we've discussed, then there's a second layer, and that one is going to be about youth, and really specifically helping young people to be empowered to have the best possible behavior, right? And that will really prevent that. And that was a really fun and cool curriculum that we developed with some partners who had been doing youth curriculums for a while.
Okay, so I want to follow up on that youth curriculum, but as you were just walking through that, I wanted to ask a follow-up question, right? So when the concept paper calls out, you chose the orphans and vulnerable children and the abstinence and behavior change for youth, right? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, were there any discussions about why these two areas and not some of the kind of more medical testing and treatment? And I say that just because Samaritan's Purse has this amazing medical wing, and so what was the thinking around that these were the two that were best for Samaritan's Purse?
Okay, I don't remember all of the details around that, and I know that what we realized was that many of our hospital partners were already in networks that were looking at how they would go forward to compete for that. And we weren't interested in competing against any of them, but rather seeing what are the gaps that we could fill. And one of the large groups that got one of those early treatment grants was Catholic Relief Services, or CRS, right. And their programs worked a lot with faith-based institutions across the many PEPFAR countries. I mean, I think it was a large number of them. I can't remember the exact number. But they really said they were, when they were kind of taking that piece on, and we recognized that a lot of these hospitals were already working with that collaboration. We weren't trying to be in competition. And in fact, we had several conversations about whether we wanted to stop applying just as Samaritans First or join a collaboration with like Food for the Hungry and even World Relief, which is the organization I work with now. At one point in this process, we kind of asked about it. And I said, I think the way that it was written, there were multiple awards that were going to go out. I think for the treatment side, there might have been fewer, I'm maybe wrong about this, but there might have been fewer awards. And I think our thought was we wanted all the faith-based hospitals to be, in the best coalition to get the most kind of out of everything that they could.
Yeah. Great, thank you. That's really helpful. So let's go back to the curriculum, right? So do you remember who some of these partners were, and how was this different from the curriculum that had come before? And what were some of so you talked about the kind of layered goals for these, but how did this look like a scaled up project of what y'all had been doing before?
Yeah, I really wish I could. Why can I not remember the name of this group out of Atlanta, Georgia? I don't know why I cannot place this. Anyway, they had a guy in Africa named David Kabiswa in Uganda. And we had a staff named Peter Wainaina out of Kenya. And those two guys came together with myself, Sarah Aronson, who was an education background person, Lindsay Plummer, who also had an educational background. And both of them were doing kind of different project roles in, respectively, I think, Mozambique and Uganda at the time. Myself, Lori Thompson, David Kabiswa, and Peter Wainaina, and I think we had a couple of characters that came in and out. We got together to develop the curriculum for that sort of step one, the mobilizing piece. And we used a lot of some of the basics from that Africa Inland Mission curriculum, but we painted the picture in that room that we had this idea that we really wanted it to be like a kind of a step-by-step process. And what our project looked to do was, and I think a lot of Christian groups end up doing projects like this, I'm going to be really honest, because they all sort of have this theme of like, you bring together a couple of people from a place, you don't just bring like one, and you bring people into a group that's very local. So for us, we said, okay, we're going to enter into a new community. Let's say it's like a village, or maybe if there's really, really close by folks, we could bring several people. We're going to go into those groups and we're going to find everybody in the community we can who's working with youth. So it could be through a church, it could be through a school, or maybe you have a soccer team. We don't really mind. We're just going to figure out, that's the first step, is we're going to map out who here works with youth. And as we enter your community, and when we figure that out, we're going to say, hey, we would love to bring you together to do some training to help you understand more about HIV. And then if you commit to taking that and really working with the youth in your catchment, right, like your group, with that material, and also kind of mobilizing them to engage in service to their community around these issues. We're going to give you about 3 months to do that. And if you've really kept up, then you can come to the second training, which was this more intensive behavior change, kind of social engagement for youth. We will, and when you go through that training and we'll have you take that back to your group, right? And you roll it out. And as you've done that, then at the end, you can kind of start coming to us, and we could help mobilize like micro projects that you might want to do as a result of all this, right? So this is basically, I think we had 10 steps if I went through it all from beginning to end, but like from the mapping to the how do you select everybody to bringing people through the first training. And during that time, while after the training, we had these folks that were called mobilizers, and they would just come back repeatedly to visit in the village to see how you're doing, to check on, the kids that you're engaging with, to see what kinds of stuff they're getting into. Sometimes it would be that they're visiting a widow and like sweeping her house, that kind of thing. I mean, it was really these small scale, but it was like they were sort of there to mentor and track along to make sure that folks could come in. Because our goal wasn't to see people fail, it was to bring people through the whole process. So that when they get to the end, I mean, sometimes like their request would be like, for our area, we're going to form a little community-based organization of folks engaging with youth. And we want to have like a loudspeaker so that we can do events. Or sometimes at the end of it, it would be that we want to form a little, project that lets youth come together and do dramas or something like that. But the whole thing was, and then we could give you, $100 or $200 to make that happen. And it really wasn't that expensive. But the idea was like community by community, we would select these districts or counties or states, and we would go community by community, and our goal was saturation. So that we did step 1 here, and then we're that gets all that mapping, and we start the training, and then somebody goes and does step 1 in the next town. And so it was town by town by town, person by person, and then this idea of like really pouring into the people that got trained with those mobilizers coming along. And the goal was to see like how much can we cover in this time that we have. And I remember at the very end of the project, and in each country, I mean, we had lists of hundreds and hundreds of community level organizations, from churches to schools to community-based organizations that folks had engaged with in this process. And yeah, it was just incredible.
No, okay, that's great. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about like the day-to-day experience of this training, the trainers, and of working on this project?
Yeah, so back to falling into jobs.
Okay.
I wrote this proposal alongside colleagues here. It wasn't like by myself, but I was sort of a lead writer. And we submitted the proposal with this very famous, hold on, I'm going to ask a question here because this may need to be edited later. Who's Kenny's friend, the doctor from Washington State, and his wife? Childs, yes. Paul Childs. And Joyce worked on the curriculum too, I should say. Joyce worked on a lot of this material. But Dr. Paul Childs, was like a missionary doctor who had worked somewhere in Southeast Asia for a really long time. And we had put him in to be our chief of party. This is a big thing with USA that you say, and we were like, here's this big resume with he's a doctor, he's all this stuff. And they rejected him as our chief of party. And in part, it was because they didn't think his experience was relevant to the project, right? Which was this very like youth-focused thing. And I was very young at the time of this project, and I didn't really have a ton of experience. I mean, I had been overseas and done these like small projects, but I had written this program, and I felt really passionate about seeing it come to life. Yeah. And I, for about 2 days, kind of went around thinking, I really want to do this, but it's kind of stupid. Like, they wouldn't accept Dr. Paul Childs. Why would they accept like some young 20-something sitting in the office? And I went into the office of my colleague, Dawn Norrington, and said, hey, this is kind of strange, but I really think I should be the lead of this project. And I think we should submit me. I don't have a lot of experience, but the experience I have was working with youth, writing a newsletter on HIV and doing these other like radio listening projects in Sudan. And I care about HIV, and I know what we've been trying to design together, and I think I can take this forward. And he and another colleague were like, well, okay, go pray about it, and we'll see. And we put my name forward, and somehow USAID accepted me to be the lead of this project. So that's the way I came into all this.
So when the call came out that you initially responded with the concept paper and then applied, was that was through USAID?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this is how this all, so this was after we had been accepted, our proposal had been accepted, and you have to name a chief of party, and they had refused the one we had put forward, which was sort of funny. But I don't say that because I think there's anything wrong with Dr. Paul Childs, and I have no idea why I was the person, but I just was. Yeah. And so yeah, that's how I ended up doing this. You had asked a question that I was telling that story to answer. Who was involved?
What it was like doing this work?
Oh, what it was like. Yeah. But I was really young. And what was interesting is the person who was leading the project, that small project we had in Mozambique, and I'm not saying small, like just scale-wise, it's different than having like, I think 5 years, $14 million was the MEP program. And her program was, maybe 2 million in 3 years or something. But the woman leading that project was from Canada. And my supervisor at the time and mentor, Lori Thompson here at Samaritan's Purse, had told me when we went to visit that program and to see it, and we saw the sugar cane knocked all over the train tracks and everything, that Kim had been a manager in a company, like a private company in Canada, that basically like every fruit salad in Starbucks was bought from this company. So it was kind of a big company. And what I realized was she knew something about managing, clearly, and she had also managed a project similar to this. So when I got the job, I called Kim and I said, I wonder, would you mind, could we have a call once or twice a month where I just ask you questions about how to manage and lead a project? Because I didn't know what I was doing, and she was the person who I thought probably knew the most, and also was female, and also was somebody that I could, easily talk to. And she agreed to do that, and she did it even after she left Samaritan's Purse and went back to her job at this fancy company that I do not know the name of. And it was amazingly helpful because my day-to-day got shaped really largely by the mentoring she gave me. And it's interesting because the project is infused with exactly that, right? This idea that people are mentored by someone who's close from their culture, and we don't just train them and sort of send them off, but we kind of come alongside them. And then I ask for that to kind of come into my own job. So I would meet with her, and she would tell me super basic things like, okay, make sure that every month, every manager for all the project managers for all the countries, that they have a work plan and they do all this stuff. I mean, basic things, but it was her that shaped that. She said, you have a weekly call with each and every one of those project managers. She and Lori Thompson together had really influenced me, and we pushed really hard that the managers of every country level team were from the countries. Now, you might have heard me saying before, there were expatriates who were the country directors and a lot of the other managers. We pushed for this because we realized this is deeply community-led and community-driven, and we needed it to look like folks from the country. And I think at the time it was a little controversial because, not controversial like a fight, but it was new. This idea that for a big amount of money, we would do this by having folks who were Kenyan, Ugandan, Ethiopian, and Mozambican be the leaders of this project. And in this massive USAID project, we had a finance person based here in Boone and myself based here in Boone and a project support person doing admin work. But really everyone else who touched this, at the sort of real program making it happen level were Africans. And so we did these weekly calls. My day-to-day work, I would do these calls. I talked to somebody Monday through Thursday, and made sure that I touched base because early my morning would start with one of those where we would talk about how's it going, what's happening, where are the hangups, what are the bottlenecks, what's needed. We would do a lot of working with USAID. I did a lot of the correspondence directly with USAID here to let them know where we were. Right, we had work plans that we had to do for each year. We had to send reports. We also sometimes needed support with things like getting vehicles and getting waivers for certain stuff. I mean, we did a lot of making agreements with folks who would provide like HIV counseling and testing, So a lot of that kind of back and forth. And then I did a ton of travel. In fact, at one point I was the most traveled person in SP for a few years. And I always joked that I had a house in Boone and a locker in Kenya because we had this guest house in Nairobi. And that was where like I kept stuff because Nairobi was a pretty good hub where I could fly between all the countries, and I would fly over and I could get stuff, that I could leave stuff there, then kind of go to Uganda for a few weeks, and I would do these massive, I would sometimes be gone 6-8 weeks doing this kind of travel to help really get things started. And I did a lot of the initial training and helping people to see, like what it is we're about. We really wanted, and this was, when I say we, at this point, it became the program managers from each country. We really felt like it was important for folks to see and understand that this program is about mobilizing and equipping and training people so that we can prevent HIV infections among youth. And we can do that through really promoting positive behaviors, right? And this is what we're going to be about. And we wanted everyone to know it, even the drivers that worked with us. And they really did. And it was amazing. In fact, in Ethiopia, one of the cool things was our drivers got so into it. Like, we engaged them to a point where they made us aware that the routes in the area where we were in the southern part of Ethiopia, which is a main thoroughfare between Kenya and Ethiopia, that those routes had a lot of truckers and folks that were at high risk. And so they wanted to take the materials and make sure that truckers understood what are the facts about HIV and why there shouldn't be stigma. And so I think it really was an interesting time, and it was a really exciting time. There was a lot of ownership. And then the other part that was really amazing is that we had this great team of folks working on really strong monitoring and evaluation of our project. And that was another big piece that we engaged in. So once a week, I would also be talking with Dr. Alamu Makonnen, who was our lead for monitoring evaluation, and with our partners at Johns Hopkins University, who did kind of the work to, every year we did these big population-based household surveys in the areas where we were doing our intervention to kind of see, looking at some behavioral markers at the household level, and some markers around stigma and some markers around other things to see what changes we made. And the monitoring was a really big deal because we wanted folks to really, not just to keep records so that we could report, but to really make something like this work at the scale we're talking about, to make sure that those mobilizers could go and actually know faces and names. You have to have records. And so we kept them, and we were really meticulous about tracking people through this big process and making sure that we kind of understood, because the goal was to get people successfully all the way through and to really reach folks in the communities. And so, we set up for each of those steps, there were specific indicators we were looking at, and that was part of our monthly reporting, right? And we would review and say, okay, where are we getting to? Where are we falling behind? Where do we maybe need to consider something different? Did we target right here? Sometimes maybe we were over ambitious and maybe we were under ambitious in others. And so there was a lot of that. But those annual surveys really helped drive us. We got to train all of our teams to do this stuff with a team from Johns Hopkins, and they got certificates in that, which was really pretty meaningful to them, and to have those contacts with some really great professional folks who also were really impressed by and interested in how engaged and driven by their faith all these teams of staff were. So it was a really fun, I think they were sort of in awe of what was going on. And what we ended up seeing was, I think we had some impacts on the delay of sexual debut, especially in the younger kids. It wasn't that great for just overall, but especially those younger ages, it worked really well. We saw actually an uptick in people who responded that they really saw monogamy as a behavior that they identified themselves as participating in, right? So this idea of being faithful, really working out. And we saw people actually doing testing, and we saw changes in stigma in those 5 years. So it was really cool that we put that stuff in place, and really went after it.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I have a couple of follow-up questions,
Yeah.
just because you gave us so much great information. You know, one of the things about PEPFAR was this kind of emergency nature, right? And that the idea was that that this would be handed over locally over time. And so, you know, can you tell us a little bit, you know, you just mentioned about how meaningful it was to have people get certificates, right? You know, can you tell us a little bit about how did you identify and hire those people who would be the local country directors, and, you know, what kind of education did they already have, or what kind of training did they need to make that possible? I know that's a deep dive question.
Yeah, everyone was different. And I'm glad I just remembered. At lunch I said the wrong name. Juliana was our program manager for Mozambique. She was kind of just an experienced program manager who'd worked with other NGOs before, but she had this kind of quiet strength about her. What I remember is, I mean, in each country, we wrote the job descriptions and we reviewed as a team, like the country directors and myself and others, the resumes, and then we shortlisted people, and I participated in the interviews for all of them. And we kind of made these decisions together, like about who presented. Juliana just seemed to have that really strong, like, understanding of what it was to lead a big project, and also an understanding of the context in Mozambique and the culture, and wanting to really coordinate, because that was another piece. Like, I've just talked about the community level, but at the sort of county or district level where we were working, you also needed to really have this way of networking with the government health providers, with the faith-based health providers, with an understanding of who else is working in the area that might be doing similar work. And she really had that, and I felt like, in a really neat way, also had a vision of how this project could grow in Mozambique. So she was really one kind of type of manager. We had Dr. Patrick Katanga, who became the lead of the project when I took this other role, like being the sort of team lead at the time for all of what HIV was doing. But Patrick was, you know, a doctor who had worked clinically and had some experience with HIV on that side. But he came in and he has this delightfully sweet and very visionary, you know, almost dreamy, like he's always like, what could the world be, you know, kind of way of being. And he also was from a rural area of Kenya and liked that we were going to be working in a rural area and looking at young people, and felt like he had been given a lot of opportunity in life and kind of really wanted to do that. Meseret Mengistu was our first program manager in Ethiopia, and she had worked, I feel like, program managing for like an embassy maybe or something. It was a kind of a different role, but she understood a lot about the various church cultures and community structures in Ethiopia, and so it seemed like she would be really good at that sort of coordination level. And I cannot remember, Pamela, and I can't remember her second name, in Uganda, who was our first manager, was also somebody who had worked in the National AIDS program there at some point, and was really passionate about kind of seeing how we could make this work. So I don't know, it just seemed like the right people came in. And then in each country, we also had a lead for monitoring and evaluation, and those folks were really critical, you know, for each one.
Yeah. So that is my next question, is because that was the other thing built into PEPFAR, right? Beyond you wanting to know that what you do works, PEPFAR was designed with this kind of accountability in mind. Can you tell us about a little bit more about you know, how all of these organizations that you're working with are reporting, and how all of that kind of moves upward and into USAID?
Yeah. So for us, I mean, we developed, and at that time it was all paper-based. I mean, this is before we had all the fun, like, tablets, and you can on your phone collect data. So we had, you know, just paper-based registers. And everyone who went through training got trained in also how to use their register and to write down names. And then from the level where they would take the data, then needs to be anonymized somehow so that you can protect the identities of people. And so the mobilizers would have like a register that's like a level up with an identifier, but not a name. And then you're kind of, but you also have to, at their level, they had to check for duplication in names and assigning people. I mean, because it's very possible that in a small village, someone could be on the soccer team and go to the church, right? So there was a lot of this no double counting was like the sort of bane of the M&E people's existence, I think, because they always were trying to figure out, how are we going to figure out, and then how many names do you need? Because in Africa, many people's names are very similar, or you could have 14 Musa Mohammeds or something, and then you're going to have to figure out, well, do we use grandfathers' names too, or what do we add here? So it was a really interesting time. We also were told many times by USAID folks that we were sort of undercounting ourselves, because when we would have big events, like community level events, we wouldn't bother with counting there because, first of all, if doing a register is just ridiculous, right? Yeah. And then if you do a head count, you're clearly going to be double counting somewhere. And so I think we just tended not to. And we kept getting told, oh no, just count the crowd. And then I was like, on the monitoring side, we would sit around and we're like, okay, so if we count the crowd, then we would just use like a max number for that, then like for whatever category that would be. And then would that max number be what we always use? I mean, it was just hilarious. And having worked at PEPFAR in many levels, that conversation just happens over and over again because people are trying to figure out, what is the best way we can do this to represent the true work without misrepresenting. And it's very difficult. Yeah.
Okay. So I think, am I missing anything about MET, right? Right, and say we've kind of talked about the curriculum, the reporting, yes. The training. Interesting. If we think about the kind of PEPFAR funding through USAID, right? Did you feel like Samaritan's Purse had to adapt any of its work to kind of be more in line with what PEPFAR required?
It's funny. I feel like we had both internal things that we struggled through and then external things. Okay. So I remember internally taking a curriculum, and this, I don't know if this is the PFH materials or if it was the MET program materials, but I remember taking them to this guy that worked in our creative department, and he was a really great graphic designer, a guy named Jimmy Pineda, who's still at Samaritan's Purse. And I took this stuff to him, and he was like, I mean, this is all really great, but I don't know how we're ever going to get this through our president's office, because he was so nervous about the content, because you have to talk about sex when you talk about HIV, and that can be a little bit uncomfortable, right? And so in the midst of all of that, I remember thinking, I was like, well, I don't really know either.
I'm just thinking about the drawing.
Right.
The flip books. Yeah.
Right. The drawings. Oh, the drawings was a whole other thing. Yeah. So I don't really remember how all that got resolved. I remember everyone seemed like a little nervous and a little antsy, and I didn't feel like it was my problem to solve. And so in a way, I think I just sort of kept handing it to people and be like, we'll see what happens. I don't know, and it did work out. So whatever. I can't remember exactly how we solved all that. I mean, it might be that some materials went forward for review and some materials we decided were more field-based, or they came from other sources. I don't remember all of those details, but I remember that being a lot of discussion. And then with USAID, we had a lot of discussion about how, okay, so do we present this work? And in the end, I mean, I think what we did was, it wasn't completely faith neutral, in that we recognized that if you want to motivate people of faith, you can use the language of faith, and that works really well, and it's actually important, and it's a part of the relationship building. And we had USAID review our curriculum, and it went forward. So I remember there were some scripture references in what we put forward. Later, which is really funny. I mean, like the program had been going and we'd been using the curriculum. And when I say later, it was actually much later. I got a call from like the third different faith-based initiatives office director at USAID. I mean, because there'd been a couple at this point. I'd been friends with most of them who called me. And I was actually driving from Charlotte to Boone after a trip. And she was like, I'm just looking at this curriculum. It could really get us into a lot of trouble. You in trouble and us in trouble. It's really terrible. Like, how could you do this? And at the time, and actually this is still a rule. I mean, well, USA doesn't really exist right now, but if it did, there was always a rule that basically you had to separate activities by time and place that were more overtly religious. So we had things in the curriculum and we just kind of said, well, we can separate by time or place in that, like, we can share that scripture, you know, not necessarily during the typical training time, or if we wanted to say there's a time you can come at 8:30 if you want to be here for prayer and devotions, and you can come at 9 for training. And there were people in USAID who weren't comfortable with that, but we hadn't had anybody really resist us. And this lady called, I think she was a little shocked because I don't think she had realized how much we had actually included. And she was like, well, I just don't know if this is going to get us into trouble. And I said, well, I don't think you are going to get into trouble because we've already been using it.
But also, had the presidential administration changed? Right? Like, I'm wondering.
No, this was still in those years.
Okay.
And I think there were just concerns, right, that maybe like we had gone too far, like we had just included too much, which is funny because I think we were pretty light, you know, like, to be honest. I mean, especially compared to some other curriculum that we had as an organization and other things. But I think because of and I can understand from her perspective and having worked in the U.S. government, there are a lot of things that you do to try to figure out, okay, where is the line and where can we really be? And I think we probably did walk up to the line, but our idea was, again, not to exclude anyone, but rather to be clear that, like, we are talking in many, many cases to people who are Christian and who are even church leaders, even in these communities. And if we use this language to communicate to people, this actually is a motivational behavior change. It's a real driver of change. I mean, at that time, there were multiple, if you look at sort of behavior change theories and models, there are plenty of those that actually talk about people's sense of what God wills. And it's fine for us to sit in Washington, D.C. and be a little bit itchy about it because it's not a super sort of secular thing to do. But we didn't notice that being the problem where we were implementing. And I think that was what I was able to say to her was, like, it's okay. Like, if you're not comfortable with this, we can certainly talk about it. We can have a conversation. But I don't think this has been an issue where we've been going. And even when I've been on the field with USAID representatives, I mean, there was a woman who, I'm not really sure of what her background was, but she worked with the USAID mission in Uganda, and she went out to the field with us, and she was saying, it's really fine as long as you separate by time and place. And so that was sort of our driving concept, right? Separate by time or place, and if it's in the curriculum, people can take it or leave it, right? Like, it's there, but it's not, you know, sort of.
With these country level leaders and like the kind of local partners that you're working with, were they primarily like kind of Christian and churches, or, you know, because I'm thinking like several of the countries you work in, right? There's in Ethiopia, right, like the Coptic Church. There's Muslims in a number of these countries that you're working in. Were your partners primarily?
Yes.
Okay.
Primarily, and we actually did include some Muslims in our training because, again, when we are going community by community, you might find Muslims who are doing these things, but we actually had conversations. I mean, I remember up in Maua, Kenya, where these are these mountains of Kenya in these highland areas. And in one area, the team, when I came in to visit for kickoffs, had me go and visit the sheikh, like the lead Muslim leader for the area, and have like a tea or a coffee with him. So that we could talk about this, because we wanted to make sure we could engage them. And we let them know, well, we're Christian. We are coming in, and the materials may have some references. Your leaders could feel free to use those or leave them. I mean, Kenya is fairly used to living side by side It's a little different context. It's not very heated. But he was very open to us working together. I think people would rather be included than excluded. And so we tried to make sure we did that. But by and large, the vast majority of folks that we trained, I think, did come. And I'm trying to remember, I think Ethiopia had the highest number of churches that we engaged in those community levels, and I think it was something like 600. And then elsewhere, it was like, I think our low level was around 200, and most were falling in the 300 range by the end of these projects. That's a lot of churches in a lot of places.
Yes. Yeah. On a more kind of, on the ground level, were there Samaritan's Purse relationships with other like NGOs or faith-based organizations that were also getting funding from USAID or PEPFAR to do similar works? You talked a little bit about the kind of mentorship, vertically, but were there other kind of leaders of other funded organizations with whom you were talking and planning and working or learning from?
Yeah, so there were actually, they brought together the Track 1 ABY partners, and I'm assuming also the OVC partners, but we weren't part of that, pretty early on to discuss what our plans were, like in our work planning phases. And this would have been 2004, and we were convened by USAID, but the folks who facilitated that meeting was a group called Christian Connections for International Health, or CCIH, that are still around today. And at the time, the executive director was this guy named Ray Martin, who's a retired World Bank and USAID person. He's a lovely human. And he really had encouraged USAID to have this kind of meeting. And so it brought together the leads of all of the programs that were doing Track 1. And in that room were some amazing folks. A woman named Debbie Dortzbach led the World Relief Program, and she's wonderful, and I know her still and work with her, along with a woman named Rebecca Heidkamp, who's still one of my closest personal friends. Of the CCIH conveners, Ray Martin was there with someone called Allison Hurling at the time, now Allison Hurling Ruark, who's one of my dearest friends to this day, was in my wedding. I'm saying all this because
I think we interviewed Alice.
That makes sense.
Yes,
she would be someone that I would imagine you could interview. Yes. So that room full of people, Tom Davis from Food for the Hungry, and I think along with him might have been Phil Moses. But this was a room full of folks, many of whom I would consider to be some of my strongest colleagues, and many of them Christians. So we got connected through like CCIH and some other kind of collaborative groups. That formal convening led to a lot of like just collaborating. I think we had a follow-up meeting sometime later. I can't remember how far down the road, but we all started to network together as well at CCIH meetings and at the core group, bringing the core up again, which is, at the time it was primarily focused on the child survival programs of the U.S. government, which no longer exist, but it still exists as a convener of folks who do community-based work. And they had an HIV group that looked at social and behavior change, just like CCIH did. So a lot of us just started to be like colleagues in these different technical working groups. We shared things. Food for the Hungry was utilizing, and so were World Relief. They were both using the care group model, which originated out of World Relief as a child survival program. And it's very similar. It's actually like you bring together a group of peers or youth who then they have, a group of say 10 to 14 neighbors or whatever that are their peers that they reach out to. And that model, they were kind of like doing a model like that, sort of similar to ours. Tom Davis experimented with using some like trainings on motivational interviewing, which I found super fascinating and also very, very complicated. And I have since learned that it went about the way that that I can now see would seem right. Motivational interviewing, if you don't know what it is, it's this where you actually try to, through very active listening with someone, listen for openness to change, like kind of you have to understand sort of the theories of like when people are open to change. And then when you hear this kind of change talk, knowing how to utilize open-ended questions to sort of drive folks towards positive behavior change. And it's a really cool thing. Doctors use it, for example, with smoking cessation programs in the US. It's an evidence-based model. What's really tricky about all that, in case you didn't pick up on it while I was talking, is that it's very language-based. And it's also theory plus language-based. So to take something like that and then also translate it into other languages and then get other people in those languages to understand those theories, concepts, models, and also change talk, there's a lot of room for error.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's tricky. I think people are just trying to apply the best of science alongside this really strong motivation that folks had in a really difficult situation to see some good changes. But yeah, so we learned a lot from each other. We got to present a lot of ideas, and yeah, it was fun.
That's great. So I'm starting to wrap up the kind of Samaritan's Purse PEPFAR phase of our interview. But before I move on, am I missing anything? Right? I think were you here through the whole length of that 5 years of funding?
I think I was here through the entire 5 years of the funding, but my last year or so, I was a director of like all the HIV stuff. So I kind of zipped into a different category. Okay. One thing that I still laugh about is that within Samaritan's Purse, I talked about there were some of these internal wave-making things that would happen occasionally. And one of the things that happened is that I was asked to lead the devotions one day, and I hadn't been asked before. And I was really excited to get to talk, but I also had realized whenever I spoke about HIV in any context, in the US or outside, I always needed to think about stigma. And also to be willing to correct some misconceptions, right? So one thing that happened is I got up to speak in our devotions, and I shared two kind of contrasting stories. One was a lady in Uganda who, through the MET program, a husband in a community had come and said, look, my wife is she's living with HIV. She's also a drunk. It's really difficult for us to have a good family life. And he had asked for his pastor to pray with their family, to pray for some things to change, to pray that she would be able to get on medication and all this stuff. And her story ended up being one of those awesome stories, right? Like, she got on medication, she gave up drinking, their family life changed. It was really beautiful. And so it was really exciting to tell that story in the devotions. And the contrasting story was this gentleman in India that I had seen when we were working on Prescription for Hope there, who his family had been outcast from their families because they had become Christians from a Hindu background. And he was living with AIDS. And when I went to visit him, living in a small portion of a sea container, so a shipping container, he was lying on a bed and he was dying. And he asked us to sing hymns with him. And while we sang hymns, he found enough strength to lift up his hand. But he died not long after that. And one of the things that I wanted to say to my colleagues here was that in both of those situations, God loved and cared for those people, and they turned out really differently. And that was really important for me because I didn't want everyone to think that it was always this huge victory, right? Yeah. But God didn't love anyone any less, right? So that was part of our story. But also in this same talk, I tried to give like just the high level sort of, do you understand what's happening with HIV? And I had gotten these great stats slides from people. And in fact, it's not like Africans are way more promiscuous than folks in the US. In fact, the average lifetime number of sexual partners in sub-Saharan Africa was like 1 point something. So it's like one and an oops. It's not like this highly promiscuous society. So I was trying to talk through this, and somehow I said, it's not like folks are having, and I meant to say multiple sexual partners, and I said multiple orgasms in the devotions. And I went back to my desk, And I was like getting people coming by, and I don't even know that I had realized I'd said it. It was just like a malapropism or whatever. And like I started hearing it, especially from like the guys that knew me well, like how they were all like raking me over the coals. And then I get a phone number coming up on my phone, and I used to call them a spy phone. And it was the president's office, and I thought, oh, this is it. I am like being fired by Franklin Graham because I have said this naughty thing in the devotions. And actually it was this sweet lady that worked in the president's office who was Franklin's longtime assistant, and she was thanking me and telling me how much it had meant to her to hear those two stories and for us to recognize that God is near. And I was so thankful that what stuck with her was the good story and not my like slip of the tongue. Yeah. So anyway, that's a fun story.
Could you rewind for a second, and just for anyone who might be listening who doesn't understand the devotional, can you for someone?
Yeah, so Samaritan's Purse has every morning at its headquarters, its international headquarters in Boone, a devotional time where the entire staff gathers. So it is huge. It's across departments. It's hundreds of people, and now maybe more than that. I don't know. I'm sure it's more, but it was hundreds of people, and you would all be in there, and not everybody knew or understood the context of everyone else's work. And I think it was pretty new at that time to have different folks leading. So it was a really interesting.
It was a really interesting slip of the.
I will also say one more really touching thing for me was I would, every time there would be orientation, if I was in town, I would go and do the quick orientation around Prescription for Hope, around what HIV work we were doing. And one thing that really touched me was a time when after that, somebody who was going through orientation told me that he had been in prison before, and he was hired to work in the facilities here, and he had never heard anyone from a church talk about AIDS before, and he wished that someone had talked to him about it before prison, because he had exposure to people living with HIV in prison, and he kind of knew about it, and it was a problem. And I remember being so glad that he had had somebody open that door in a place maybe that he didn't think it could be opened for. And I think that's, again, the heart of what all this work is about, whether it happens here in Boone, North Carolina, or around the world in Mozambique.
Thank you. Do you want to tell us about the kind of wrapping up, right? So the Samaritan's Purse PEPFAR support through USAID was a 5-year project, right? And so what's it look like as you wrap that project up and do some final reporting? And I think earlier this week, Ken Isaac said you were really wonderful with the data and the reporting. So can you tell us about that?
I mean, I think that was one of our big things, is that we wanted to be able to tell the story about what the impact had been. We did a really nice, published full report of our final evaluation. And really that was showing not just the monitoring that was required, which is the PEPFAR data side, was more monitoring focused, but looking at that population-based annual survey at the household level. And we used a type of monitoring or surveying called lot quality assurance sampling, which at the time was fairly new in the humanitarian and development world, and now it's used much more frequently. People typically did a different type of sampling of surveys, so it was kind of a fun thing that we were a little buzzy and could show we were doing this neat thing with our sampling. But the key thing that it did was it made it really easy for throughout the project at a really broken down level, without having to get a massive sample at those broken down levels, let people look at all these different indicators to see whether or not those indicators were meeting what we would call the decision rule, which was just kind of like a key level, like we're trying to reach. So it could be a target or something, or it could be like a standard, an international standard. And if in, let's say, this really particular sub-county or something, things weren't kind of meeting that, then we could adapt our program, right, to focus more specifically on improvements there in this particular way. Or let's say over here we see, hey, we're doing really well at counseling and testing, but in this area like they're doing better with youth. What are they doing here that they're not doing there? And so those supervisors could then talk, right? And they could come up with ways to problem solve together. So we really believed in this like data-driven decision making, even though I wouldn't have known that term to use at the time. And when later I worked in PEPFAR, you know, when people would say it, I was like, yeah, I'm totally for that. It really, because it empowers local leadership, to be honest, right? If you have that at your fingertips, and it's not just like going all the way up into some document. So I will talk about the end document report, but that is less the point than it is having like really local level leadership be able to not just have data at their fingertips, but to understand how to use it.
Right.
And then to be able to take that and say, well, we need to do this differently here. I kind of told you that 10-step process. It ended up looking really differently, especially like the way that groups got organized at the end, because folks were like, that's not going to make sense here. We actually need to do this. Like, let's do it this way. And that kind of dialogue, I really trusted our partners on the ground. Like we believed in kind of, we knew how to set up, like, let's do training, let's do mentoring, let's kind of walk through these steps. But we really trusted folks. Once you've gone through all that training and you've got ideas about how you want to organize things and what you want to make it go, like, go for it, right? Like, there's plenty of freedom there. So I think that was really fun. But our final report, like, I mean, it was like almost like a magazine. And my husband teaches statistics in high school. This is kind of a silly thing, but he used to use it as part of his classroom stuff. This was before we were married. I gave it to him like as a sort of, and he's like, oh, this is a great tool to show people like how statistics in the real world can work. So it's sort of that's just sort of a fun tidbit too. But I think the main thing was that we really wanted to have not just reports that went to USAID, but things that could like show the full story of what this project really was and what it achieved, and then also what it didn't. And some of that was also about us presenting it. So I did a presentation at the Global Health Council 1 year at their meetings to try to see where did we succeed and what was hard. And there were indicators we did well on and indicators we didn't. But we reached the people we said we were going to reach, and we, by and large, I think the impact was overwhelmingly positive. Like you don't always get all the way. And it's funny that I feel like in more recent years, there's this kind of buzzy thing to say that, you know, you learn from your failures or like that kind of thing. But I think we were always just like, what can we do to make sure that we're using these resources, these massive resources, to reach as many people as possible in as positive a way as possible to really bring hope, right? And I don't know, I think we were able, at the very least, to engage people in a really positive way and in a way that felt good to them. As the project started ending, you know, there were a lot of people that wished we had a follow-on or that we had ways to do things, and that didn't happen for us overall. But one thing that has happened is that I have had things like where I showed up in Rwanda for something and I encountered a woman who got trained through that program and lived in Kamwenge, Uganda at the time, and she remembered the training and she talked about how she could use that in groups. Or, you know, any number of those leaders that we had at various levels, whether they were in the monitoring groups or supervisors or whatever, who went on to have other types of leadership roles. Many of those community level folks who were really well trained and ready for whatever would come next. And I think there are pockets of that all over Africa, not just from the program that Samaritan's Purse did, but also from those other Track 1 type programs and partners. And that is a type of capacity that is built at those community levels. And I think has created a network of really strong potential partners for lots of other types of activities as well.
Can you talk about, you know, after the kind of wrapping up, or I guess before the wrapping up, you know, was there talk about pursuing additional PEPFAR funds in the next phase to do any sort of follow-up work, right? You just mentioned that some people were wishing for it. You know, what was the kind of PEPFAR thinking about next steps or not next steps?
So I think by that time, you know, that was the end of the first authorization of PEPFAR and into the second, that there was already a shift in thinking of like what could be more local. And part of local was that the USAID missions in those countries, rather than out of DC, would take more leadership and ownership moving forward, especially of these more social programs like the OVC and the abstinence and behavior change for youth programs. And I mean, this is actually a kind of common occurrence. I mentioned the child survival programs. Okay, child survival grants kind of went that same direction eventually. They had been done out of Washington, D.C., and over time they were sent sort of to USAID missions. Well, it's interesting. There have always been tensions between USAID missions in countries and DC, and I don't really understand all the nature of that, except that, you know, when you're based in one place versus another, like it's not always that easy to figure out how to collaborate. And those missions always had a lot of money that they were managing and partners and mechanisms. And so when these folks would get funded out of DC, I think they sort of thought of those partners maybe as like DC's problem, right? And it was a little bit hard to sort of really see them as integrated into the portfolio that was being managed out of the mission. And so I don't know. I think it is really hard to make that transition. I've seen it in other types of programming, not just in this. And and I have good friends that work at USAID missions now, and I've actually had these conversations, and they've talked about how complicated it is when you have a portfolio with, let's say you have 100 mechanisms is what they would call it. So that's different projects with partner leads that you're running out of the mission. And then Washington kind of tells you that a partner is going to come in and do a project also in your country, and you kind of need to look after them. I think in your sort of list of to-dos, even in the best of circumstances, that's not going to be your number one priority, right? And so there are often, I think I've heard both on the NGO side and on the government side, laments that there aren't better relationships necessarily between those partners, but I think it's also really hard to do it. Just humanly speaking, it is difficult to manage so many things. Yeah. And so I think that's probably more likely why it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. How about personally, like as you wrapped this up, you know, how did you feel? This was a major accomplishment.
Really grateful to have been a part of something positive in the world. So thankful for my friends, those managers and leaders of all those programs, and so proud of Patrick, who had become the lead of the whole project by the end. Proud to see that in Samaritan's Purse, such a big project had such African leadership. And also already so proud to see how many people were on treatment, to see how many things were changing, to see that in all these rural areas that when we started had really high HIV prevalence, there were starting to be changes, and also treatment was actually really available and really accessible, and that was not the case when we started. So I think all of that, just being a part of something so good in the world when a lot isn't great, that was really wonderful.
Thank you. So I think it's around this time that you decided to go back to school?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I went to do my master's in public health because I decided that, you know, I should not just be like a non-credentialed Yahoo. But I went to get my
Sounds like you were plenty credentialed and experienced. Yeah.
But I went to get my master's in public health at Boston University. I went there, funny enough, my friend Allison Hurling was living there in Boston working with a researcher out of Harvard. And I went to do their visiting kind of weekend or weekday, whatever time it was. And I kind of went thinking, I'm just going to go because I want to see Allison and spend the night there as my free lodging. I thought I would go to Chapel Hill because it's right down the road in North Carolina. I was a resident and it's much more affordable. And at the end of each day of the day, they had like a sort of one-on-one visiting with you. And they said, well, what would it take for you to want to come here? And I said, oh, I'm going to go to Chapel Hill because it's a lot more affordable for me. And they said, well, what would you need to make it happen? And by this point, I've also done a lot of like negotiating on like different grants and awards. And I was like, I just said something absurd that I would need. And the following Monday, they called me and they offered it to me. And I thought, well, that's why I'm going to Boston.
That is the correct reason to go to Boston. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
it was very unusual. It was a good experience. I decided to study as much as I could, stuff that I felt like I wasn't going to be able to just pick up or that would take more time. And having already been in a sense where I worked and what I thought I would probably be doing, I knew what a work day would look like. So I was like, I know what I'm going to be able to like sort of pick up on the fly and what I wouldn't. So I think that was what was helpful about going back to grad school later, was that I could kind of select courses based on, I was like, I didn't take like an HIV class because I was like, I know that I can read about a subject matter. If you're just going to be reading articles about what's going on with HIV, I will never figure out how to do like demography on my own. So I'll take that, you know? And it really helped with like choosing classes.
How did this shape your career? Especially, I think I read, during this time you were working as a research assistant, like in Niger, Sudan, Somalia, Syria.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about this?
Yeah. Well, so I continued to do a little bit for Samaritan's Purse during the time that I was in grad school. And I worked with the Niger program around that time.
Okay.
We did some qualitative and quantitative research in some rural areas of Niger, which was really fascinating. Trying to help, they were starting up a child survival type program with UNICEF, but we were trying to look at what were some of the key behaviors and also really understand child mortality. I tried to do this methodology of looking at child mortality, and I think my data was sort of fine. I would say like, I don't think wasn't like going to be published, and I've not been aiming to be like an academic scholar, but I thought it was really pretty serviceable what we were learning. And I had a professor who did not agree with that at all. So I never sort of presented or published that. And we spent a lot more time presenting. Instead, we did this analysis of like infant and young child feeding and who were doers and non-doers around exclusive breastfeeding. And the interesting thing was that it was actually really clear cut in Niger. The women who exclusively breastfed children under age 6 were nomadic women because they were used to seeing that milk of their animals, right, could certainly like satisfy thirst and help with that issue. And so breastfeeding an infant made sense to them, right, because they lived off their herds of animals. Whereas more settled agrarian populations were like, why would you ever not give a child water? A child will die without water. And it was really interesting because it was just super clear from our data that like there was this pattern, right? That these women who came from these cultures that saw that mammalian milk could feed people sufficiently and also satisfy thirst felt very differently than these others. And the key sort of issues were going to be overcoming the sense that there was in breast milk for an agrarian woman, right? There was enough sort of nutrients and water for a baby, which was a really interesting thing. Sort of a side thing, but yeah, that was a project I did. What else did I do? I left there. I went back to Sudan to work for a few years with MedAir, which was great. I really wanted to get back to Sudan. I wanted to work in Darfur. That had been a passion, since the conflict had broken out, and I was really glad to get to do it. We led kind of primary healthcare work, essential healthcare around the state of West Darfur. It was really good experience. We were doing a lot of life-saving work, I think, and it let me use my Arabic again, which was really fun. I did that for a few years until I came home because I wanted to marry my husband.
And so I think earlier Elizabeth said we had been stalking you. And so indeed, in 2011, you went to work for the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator. Can you tell us about the decision and also, again, for the layperson, what is that office?
Yeah, so, okay, this goes back to my time with Samaritan's Purse. There was a big meeting that PEPFAR had in Durban, South Africa in about 2005, maybe 2006. anyway, it was a big meeting. They invited implementers, they invited government people. And at that meeting, I met a character named Tom Walsh. I say he's a character because he used to be one of the winningest Jeopardy champions. Like, he's played against Ken Jennings, this will tell you.
Okay.
And he's also a really great guy. But he worked for Mark Dybel, Ambassador Dybel at the time, and he stayed in the office of the U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, which is where the ambassador that leads PEPFAR sits in the State Department, and it is the body that brings together all of the U.S. government departments and agencies that implement PEPFAR. And he had set up a meeting for me at a time when I had come back to the U.S. to visit, to meet some folks there, and they had said, we would love to talk to you about when you come back, if you're coming back to the U.S., about a position here. And kind of through that connection, I ended up applying to be the Southern Africa regional lead. And based on my background, I also was the interagency lead on nutrition and HIV.
Well, so can you tell us about the position? What did it entail? What was a day in the life like?
Yeah, it was sort of an operational management position. So I corresponded with the Southern Africa coordinators, the country coordinators in Southern Africa for PEPFAR at that time. So this was in the Obama administration. And the ambassador was Eric Gooseby, who is a delightful man, if you ever get a chance to talk to him, and has a wonderful story himself. But I connected with those coordinators in each country, and kind of similar to the same things I learned a long time ago, right? Do a call with everybody once a week, make sure that I'm checking in on what needs to happen. And then I also do sort of, as the convening body, we would chair the assigned folks from each agency to be on the support teams for all of those countries. So that would be a mix of technical experts and kind of operations experts from within agencies like CDC and USAID, HHS, Department of Labor, Peace Corps. And then we had, every Monday, there was this meeting of something called the deputy principals, which were the folks that were like the second chairs under the leads of these agencies that made up PEPFAR. And it was a hideously long meeting. I think it started at 1 p.m. in the afternoon and usually ended at 4, sometimes later. And it was really a wild meeting with an agenda. And it was an interesting time. And then the technical working group, I also was supposed to be convening kind of the CDC and USAID and other counterparts of that.
So a couple of fact questions, right? So what countries counted in Southern African Regional Team? Were they like the SADC countries, or did the office have a different?
Mostly. So it was, now let me remember my region. So I'm going to try to cut across the map. So Namibia, South Africa, Lesotho, what was Swaziland, now Eswatini, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, Botswana. DRC got moved in at one point.
Okay.
I think that
sounds
it.
Right.
Yeah, that's roughly Southern Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so
it was like $1 billion or so of taxpayer money, if not more, that we were managing. And so we had to make sure that money moved into all the countries, as well as that when it was moving, we knew what it was supposed to be moving for, that it went to the right agencies within the countries, that it was programmed, so that meant in the appropriate ways, that it was programmed to meet the congressional earmarks, that the programs met what was expected based on the deputy principal's reviews of the country operational plans, that we developed something while I was there that actually still sort of exists.
Okay.
Another regional director and I, regional team lead and I had gone into the deputy principals and said, hey, there's this weird process and thing that keeps happening where there's money that was kind of getting to countries but not moving out fast enough, and it was getting a bit backlogged. But there was also this issue where money could be reprogrammed and stuff and moved around, but it just seemed like that there wasn't sort of a great way that was getting looked after strategically, right? So like we had earmarks and we had all these other things. So we started to suggest two things. And one was that we examine deeply, like where there might be sort of money that was getting backlogged like that, and figure out ways to move it quicker and to reprogram it quicker if it needed to be done. And that really went more with the finance route. But the other big suggestion that we had was that the country operational plan letters each year, like when we wrote to tell what the allocation for the country was going to be, that we should also give some ideas about, like, strategically, other than the earmarks, what did we think, looking at the evidence in the country, was important? And this was to save some time too, because countries would be sending stuff, and then the deputy principals would sit around this table and talk about, why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? You know, like, and we were like, well, why don't we just pull data into like a fact sheet that gets presented to the deputy principals on different things that they can review. And then when they send the allocation, they can say, based on what we've reviewed, and this data comes from the countries have access to it, and they see that fact sheet too. Based on what we've reviewed, this seems to be really important. And then there's a dialogue with the country to say what goes into the operational plan. And I understand that's still being used, this process of, like, within that letter, giving some strategic direction.
So can you talk a little bit more about the country operating plans and you know, what goes into making one of those, and then what happens when it gets to you? Yeah.
Good grief. Everything goes into it. So the country operational plans were like the high level strategy of the US government, the conglomeration of agencies working in each location, that said how they were going to take the allocation and break it down and what were their strategic priorities, but with like more detail and sort of skin on it. So it might even say specifically like this mechanism, like, so this implementing partner doing this work will happen in this way. Or you might have TBD mechanisms, to be determined mechanisms, which are like, we're going to put this out and actually say this is going to be something that we want to make sure will happen. Or it might be where the team would indicate they want to redirect the types of activities that folks are going to be doing. And Dr. Debbie Birx was one of the deputy principals. She was from CDC at the time. She wasn't in that office, but she was so excited when we came with these data sheets, and we're like, let's use these to like give people this direction. I mean, that's like her whole spiel, is like, we use data to drive decision making, right? And it was fun because I think we got a lot of energy around that, because we were saying, like, we can do this and we can deal with what we have.
So can you talk a little bit about like the appropriations process, right? So like if the you know, this country is being allocated this much, how do they make the decisions about, you know, how much goes to USAID or how much goes to this agency? And
I don't know if I remember all of that. I know some of it's, I mean, like, there's stuff that's earmarked that comes from Congress, and then I don't remember the sort of specific details around all of that.
And typically the earmarks are more like this amount of money should be on
go to
treatment or prevention. Yeah.
But I don't know about within the agencies. But I do know there were a lot of, I mean, like, there were tons of discussions, and it was always a thing that as an OGAC person, you were always trying to manage these competitions primarily between CDC and USAID, who had the bulk of the funding, right, to kind of make sure that folks understood, like, really clearly. Because I think especially in the first and second authorizations of PEPFAR, right, there were, in the first especially, there was just a lot of, like, everybody was doing everything. You might have had, like, CDC people and USAID people in the same clinic, right? We started to get better in the second reauthorization, and then I think by the third reauthorization, we had pretty clearly defined some lanes, right, where folks went. And I was kind of coming in the middle end of the second reauthorization, but it was a lot of work, right? And that's why at the country level, you would have these kind of large teams that sat, a coordinator that sat in the embassy, the USAID team and the CDC team, and you'd have these folks, and they would really need to spend a lot of time, like, coordinating and hashing things out and making really clear like who does what. And I think we made basically decisions that most of the time, even if a partner worked with one agency, they weren't going to also work with the other. I mean, you know, we kind of, those weren't necessarily hard and fast rules, but the idea was like, how do we make things work and make sense?
Yeah. Well, I would say I would love to ask follow-up questions on this, but we are nearly hitting 4 o'clock, and so I think what I'm going to do, if it's okay with you, is maybe just pause here. And hope that you will agree for us to do a second one in Charlotte where we can ask you some more reflective, finish the OGAC and talk about your work with World Relief and also some big reflection questions. Just because we've been sitting with you for more than a minute here. So is there anything you'd like to end this interview on, knowing that we're going to come back?
No, one of the things I would just say about OGAC that I may remember or not remember, but on a personal level, is that I had always worked with Christian organizations up to that point. And I went into the U.S. government and kind of thought, well, I'm not coming in here like waving a flag, but people can tell if you've worked for Samaritan's Purse, like where you come from a little bit. And I also thought there might be folks who had a bit of guardrails up with me because of that. So I thought, well, my goal will be every day to come in and try to, you know, like be as wise as I can and really be kind to people. And I have had so many experiences coming out of that where, first of all, the women that I worked with in that office were just incredible. Again, very good mentors to me. And many of them were Christians as well. But many of the folks who, when I came in, let me know like later on that they had been very skeptical about me, in part because of my background, or like one of them said, I just thought you were just going to be way too nice, and that was going to be the biggest problem you were going to have in the government because nobody's like that, or you're always trying to just, you know, be really clear and authentic, and like that's not what people do here. You know, but it all worked really well for you. And so I felt like even though there was a sense maybe on both sides, my own and theirs, that I was a bit of a fish out of water, it worked out really beautifully, and I have some very valuable professional and personal relationships from that time.
Oh, that is a wonderful note for us to end on today. All right, thank you so much, Emily.